In our last discussion, we focused on the concept of nation, and we understood it to be collective in nature. But let's continue and review for a moment the idea of nation. Well, again, we understand that nation is a large group of people, and as a concept, as an understanding, as a group, as a large group, people are united by common elements. We also understood, if we remember, that some of these elements may include background. It could include history, culture, or language. They also may include people inhabiting a common area, territory, or country. Any of these items or elements that people share in common that are a basis of unity, that unite people into a larger group, form the foundation and understanding of nation. And again, as I'd mentioned in the beginning, we understand that it is a collective or group characteristic or feature. Those elements, or that element, that's an important part of identity, but that is collective or group in nature. But as a concept, the idea of nation is far more complex. So let's continue with our discussion of nation, and let's look at it from a bit of a different point of view. Well, ethnologists and sociologists sometimes suggest that nation is far more complex. Some suggest that nation basically is an expression of the soul of a people. In other words, the basic essence of a group of people is what nation is. Others suggest that nation is the people, those people that are united by some common element, that is, in and of itself, nation. Others would suggest that nation basically emerges from a feeling of belonging, and that makes sense, since people are part of a larger group. That is the basis of belonging, and so nation, in essence, does emerge from that feeling of belonging. Many, however, suggest that nation is an imagined political community. In other words, one that's not in existence at this moment, but one that is sought and desired. Others would suggest that nation exists when people want self-government. In other words, a group that are united by some common element, whether it's language, history, background, culture, or a territory. When people desire, that group of people desire to exist and have self-government, that is when nation comes into existence. So as we see, the concept of nation is very complex, and its meaning and its definition has various levels to it. Let's continue though. Ethnologists and sociologists also suggest that nation as a concept is basically a set of understandings or types of understandings, and that these include such understandings as linguistic, in other words, understandings based on language. They also suggest that they're based on ethnic understandings, in other words, cultural background. There's also cultural understandings, which is very similar to ethnic understandings, but there may be some subtle differences to it. We'll see this as we move forward. There's also, in many instances, a religious understanding to nation. And since we talked about in its very original definition that nation is a group of people, a large group of people that are united by a common element such as territory, obviously then geographic understanding is one important type of understanding that makes up the idea of nation. There's also a spiritual understanding. Now, some people might think that spiritual and religious understandings are the same thing, but like with cultural and ethnic understandings, there are some subtle differences, and we'll come to understand these as well. Sociologists also talk about the fact that nation includes or incorporates political understandings. Now, why don't we take a moment and have you peruse your textbook, look at pages 23 through to 29 to see if you can find some examples from a Canadian context, in other words, Canadian examples, that basically illustrate each of these various understandings. Take a few moments to actually go about doing this. Well, here's an example, and if you looked at your text, you probably came up with this. When we look at Canada, we understand that one of the two formally recognized linguistic groups in Canada are francophones. And francophones in Canada, particularly in Quebec, share strong feelings of a linguistic nation. They understand themselves, specifically in Quebec, to be a nation based on language. And so this is a Canadian example of linguistic understandings. How about ethnic understandings? But before we go there, let's also consider the fact that with linguistic understandings, bilingualism, the official policy that recognizes two official languages in Canada, English and French, and that there are two official language groups with collective rights entrenched in the Constitution for both, Anglophones and Francophones, obviously this is an example of a linguistic understanding. Back to ethnic understandings. Multiculturalism, which is also an official policy of the federal government, in which cultural groups that share feelings of ethnicity are recognized and supported. And this is obviously a Canadian example. How about cultural understandings? Well, despite multiculturalism, there are elements of identity that we all share as Canadians, and we could suggest that that would be a Canadian example of a cultural understanding, and it would be an example of Canadian culture. The obvious come to mind, such symbols as hockey, Tim Hortons, the Great White North, our flag, our national anthem, such things as maple syrup. The list goes on. All of these make up part of the elements that we identify as Canadians, and we share these common understandings. And so, subtly different from an ethnic understanding, this is a Canadian example of a cultural understanding. I, as a Greek Canadian, would have some ethnic feelings that I share with other Greek Canadians, and yet with the other Greek Canadians, I also see myself as a Canadian sharing those elements that make up the identity of Canadian. But how about religious understandings? Well, though mainly Christian in nature, Canada as a country has a wide range of religious faiths that exist in the country, and most and almost all, as long as they follow the laws of the land, are tolerated and accepted. This would be an example of a religious understanding. We talked about geographic understandings, and obviously this would come into play with Canada being a very northern nation. Canada spans the entirety of the northern part of North America, and it is the second largest country in the world. It's a northern nation with a very long winter, and that plays an important role in our understanding of Canada as a nation. How about spiritual understanding? Well, we talked about spiritual understandings being subtly different than religious understandings, and here may be the difference. When we consider Aboriginal Canadians as an ethnic group or ethnic groups within Canada, we understand that beyond having strong feelings of ethnicity, Aboriginal Canadians also have a strong spiritual connection to the land. They actually see it as a living thing and have a strong spiritual bond. And this would be a Canadian example of a spiritual understanding. How about political understandings, the last one? Well, Canada recognizes itself as a country that is basically a federation of regions. In other words, as a federal system, we have 10 official regions or provinces, each with its own provincial government, and 3 territories with 3 territorial governments. This would be an example from Canadian context of a political understanding. So as you can see, the idea of nation, the definition, its meaning, is quite complex in nature and has various levels to it. The one we just talked about, the ideas of sets of understandings, is something that adds to the complexity of the meaning of the concept. But when we look at a particular context, that of the Canadian context as an example, we see that it's actually quite easy to understand the meaning of nation when we look at or understand it, to be redundant, from the standpoint of various understandings. Let's continue. Nation, and the idea of nation, is also looked upon in different ways. In other words, nations are classified in different ways. Ethnologists and sociologists, political scientists as well, see nations in basically 2 ways. Those as civic nations and those as ethnic nations. And so what we want to do is consider the traits of a civic nation and consider the traits of an ethnic nation. So again, use your textbook to see if you can come up with and find and list the different traits of a civic nation and the different traits of an ethnic nation.